On the 9th of April, 2021, Prince Philip died at Windsor Castle. He was 99 years old, 2 months and a day short of his 100th birthday. He had been married to Queen Elizabeth II for 73 years, the longest royal marriage in British history. The official statement Buckingham Palace released at noon that morning was brief. It said he had died peacefully. It named no one who had been with him, and no one who had not. What actually happened in those final hours, according to Giles Brandreth, who had spent years in Philip's company and wrote about the death in his biography of the Queen, was this. The night before, Philip had given his nurses the slip, shuffled along the corridor of Windsor Castle on his Zimmer frame, helped himself to a beer in the oak room, and drunk it alone. The following morning, he got up, had a bath, told his valet he felt faint, and wanted help back to bed. The Queen was in a separate room, still asleep. She wasn't called until after the doctor had come and certified his death. She was said, by those close to her, to be furious he had left without saying goodbye. His daughter-in-law Sophie, Countess of Wessex, who spoke to the cameras shortly afterwards, described it differently. "So gentle," she said. "It was just like somebody took him by the hand, and off he went." Within hours of the announcement, the newspapers were asking about one person not mentioned in the official statement, not because she had been excluded by name, but because she had been a visible part of Philip's life for 3 decades, and the people who had been watching knew it. Her name was Penelope Knatchbull. Her formal title was the Countess Mountbatten of Burma. She had been born Penelope Meredith Mary Eastwood on the 16th of April, 1953, 32 years younger than Philip. She had married Norton Knatchbull, the 3rd Earl Mountbatten of Burma, in 1979. Norton was Philip's godson, the grandson of Philip's beloved uncle, Lord Mountbatten, who had been assassinated by an IRA bomb that same year. Philip had known Norton his entire life and thought of him as close to a son. Penny had first met Philip at the age of 20 while she was dating Norton. She had been part of the extended family orbit for years before any of this began. What Penny had become to Philip, specifically in his own right, as a person rather than as his godson's wife, had developed slowly, and that the palace had absorbed and never discussed. Ingrid Seward, whose 2020 biography, Prince Philip Revealed, was the first major biography in nearly 30 years, described Penny as the second most important woman in the Duke of Edinburgh's life. Staff at Wood Farm, the 5-bedroom cottage on the Sandringham estate where Philip had retired in August 2017, had their own formulation for it. They called her his "and also." No guest list was considered complete without her. No dinner at Wood Farm was quite right if she wasn't there. This is the story of Penny Knatchbull. It's also the story of Helen Cordet, the Greek heritage cabaret singer and BBC television presenter, whose 2 children Philip godfathered, whose school fees he partly paid, and whose paternity he never addressed, not to confirm, not to deny, until he died. And it's the story of Alexandra Hamilton, the Duchess of Abercorn, known to everyone as Sasha, who told the biographer Giles Brandreth that she and Philip had a passionate friendship for more than 20 years, and was careful to explain, in terms that remain the most candid statement anyone connected to this family has ever made in public, exactly what she meant by that and what she didn't. 3 women across a 73-year marriage. Britain was shown a romance. The romance was real. The rest of it was real too. To make sense of it, you need to understand something about the man. Philip was born on the 10th of June, 1921, on the island of Corfu, on the dining room table of the Villa Montrepos, the only son of Prince Andrew of Greece and Denmark and Princess Alice of Battenberg. He was 6th in line to the Greek throne. 18 months later, following his father's exile from Greece after King Constantine's abdication, the family was evacuated by British warship. Philip was carried off Corfu in an improvised cradle. His childhood was a European case study in displacement. His parents' marriage effectively collapsed. When Philip was 8, his mother, Princess Alice, a great-granddaughter of Queen Victoria, eventually sainted by the Greek Orthodox Church, suffered a severe breakdown and was committed to the Bellevue Sanatorium in Switzerland. His father, Prince Andrew, moved to Monaco, largely absent thereafter. Philip was dispersed among relatives in England and Germany, eventually into the sustained care of his maternal uncle, Lord Mountbatten, who became the dominant male figure in his life. He attended Gordonstoun in Scotland, under the educational philosopher Kurt Hahn, who believed in physical courage, intellectual rigor, and the value of earned achievement over inherited status. Philip flourished there. The school shaped him into the man he would remain for the rest of his life: tough, direct, contemptuous of ceremony, and constitutionally resistant to being managed. He was exceptional in the Royal Navy. He served with distinction in the Mediterranean and the Far East. At the Battle of Cape Matapan in March 1941, he controlled the searchlights during a night action that contributed to the sinking of several Italian warships. His commanding officer recommended him for a mention in dispatches. He rose fast. By his late 20s, he held the rank of commander and had his own ship, HMS Magpie, with what biographers consistently describe as a genuine future ahead of him. He gave it all up in 1947 to marry the woman who would shortly become Queen. The cost wasn't small and wasn't spoken about. He renounced his Greek and Danish royal titles, converted to the Church of England, took British nationality, and eventually, when Elizabeth acceded to the throne in February 1952, surrendered even his surname. The Mountbatten name was replaced by Windsor. The uniform he wore for official occasions for the rest of his life was ceremonial, not earned. He spent the next 7 decades walking, in public, 2 steps behind his wife. A man of his energy, his pride, his need to be the most capable person in any given room. That wasn't a small thing to absorb. He absorbed it. He built the Duke of Edinburgh Awards, which by his death had touched more than 8 million young people in 140 countries. He logged more than 1 million miles on royal and official duties across his career. He took up polo and pursued it ferociously. He took up carriage driving and competed into his late 90s. He read widely, wrote letters constantly, and maintained a social orbit far larger and more varied than the court required. He went, whenever he could, alone, and the people he moved toward weren't always the ones whose company was convenient or expected. The first name is Helen Cordet, and the connection predates the marriage. She was born Hélène Foufounis on the 3rd of July, 1917, in Marseille, France, of Greek heritage, born in France, connected to the same displaced European aristocratic world Philip came from. Their families had known each other through the interconnected Greek royal and noble networks that scattered after the First War and the Greek catastrophe of 1922. As children, they had been acquainted. They reconnected in London during the Second War. Hélène had arrived in Britain as a refugee from occupied Europe, rootless in the way the war made so many people rootless. Philip was serving in the Royal Navy, young and increasingly present in London society between deployments. Hélène built a career. She became a cabaret performer, poised, European, stylish in the way that London in the late 40s found newly glamorous after the austerity of war. She became a BBC television presenter, hosting Café Continental, a variety program that drew large audiences through the late 40s and early 50s. Philip was known to attend her shows. He was seen at the Milroy Club. He was seen at her dressing room after performances. Palace courtiers who were watching were anxious enough to try to keep him away. 2 children were born to Hélène's marriage to Marcel Boisseau, a captain in the Free French Air Force. Max Boisseau was born in 1943. Louise Boisseau, who would take her mother's professional surname and be known as Louise Cordet, briefly a pop star in the early 60s, was born on the 8th of February, 1945, in Wraysbury, Berkshire. Both children carried the Boisseau surname from their father. Both children had Philip as their godfather. Philip paid Max's school fees at Gordonston, his own school. The fact is documented and never disputed. Whether he contributed to Louise's education, she attended the French Lycée in Kensington and a convent school, isn't confirmed by available sources. The paternity rumors began early and never fully stopped. European newspapers, less constrained by the relationship their British counterparts maintained with the palace, discussed the question directly. The circumstantial evidence was laid out each time the same way. Godfather to both children, school fees paid for the son at Philip's own alma mater, lifelong close contact, and the timing of Max's birth in 1943. The British press stayed largely quiet. Philip said nothing. Hélène, in her memoir, Born Bewildered, wrote in ways that gestured toward the question without settling it. She never confirmed. She never denied. One complication the record preserves: Marcel Boisseau didn't formally claim legal paternity of the children until years after their births, not until shortly before Hélène's memoirs were published. Whether that reflects wartime paperwork and the chaos of the Free French forces, or something else entirely, is another question that goes unanswered. Max Boisseau became an economics professor and spent much of his career in China at the Euro-Chinese Business Center. He had to address the rumors regularly for his entire adult life, and his statement on the record was consistent. "I have heard these rumors all my life," he told the press, "but they are ridiculous. My father, my real father, lives in Paris, and it's silly to say otherwise. All this goes back to their childhood friendship, and there's nothing more to it than that." Philip said nothing. Hélène said nothing that resolved it. She died in Switzerland on the 30th of April, 1996, having made clear, more than once in interviews, that her secrets were her own to keep. The question is now unanswerable. No DNA test has ever been done, and none can now be compelled. What the record shows is a man who stood as godfather to both of his childhood friends' children, paid for the son's education at his own school, maintained the friendship for decades, and never, in any forum, said a single word about it in either direction. The first time the arrangement between Philip and the Queen nearly became visible to Britain wasn't through any of the women in Philip's life. It was through a divorce. In October 1956, Philip departed on a solo world tour aboard the newly commissioned royal yacht HMY Britannia. The official purpose was substantive. He opened the 1956 Melbourne Olympic Games at the Melbourne Cricket Ground on the 22nd of November, the first games held in the Southern Hemisphere. The tour then continued through New Zealand, New Guinea, Antarctica, and other Commonwealth territories. Philip was away from Britain for 5 months. His private secretary and closest companion on the tour was Commander Michael Parker, known as Mike, Australian-born, irreverent, fiercely loyal to Philip, and in the process of separating from his wife Eileen. Parker had been at Philip's side since 1947. He was, by multiple accounts, more a friend than an employee. Parker resigned his post in early 1957 under circumstances that were described as voluntary. Eileen Parker filed for divorce in 1958. The grounds were adultery. The named correspondent was a woman called Mary Alexandra Thompson. The divorce had nothing to do with Philip directly. The allegations concerned Parker alone. But the newspapers drew their own conclusions about the company Parker had been keeping on a 5-month yacht tour, and about what a 5-month absence from your new queen might signify. There were headlines. Sarah Bradford, in her biography Elizabeth, a biography of Britain's queen, identifies this period as one of genuine strain. Philip was elevated to the rank of Prince of the United Kingdom on the 22nd of February, 1957. a move that the American press, interestingly, noted placed him in a more protected legal position with respect to any proceedings touching the Parker divorce. Whether that was coincidence or management is the kind of question that produces only speculation. The palace denied everything with precision and gave nothing away. The story, without solid evidence and without any royal admission, quietly collapsed. Parker eventually moved to Australia. Philip returned to his marriage, his work, and his public discipline. He drew a conclusion from this episode and applied it for the next 40 years. If you give them nothing solid, they can't hold it. He never gave them anything solid again. What replaced the visible crisis was a pattern, sustained and consistent enough that calling it a pattern undersells what it actually was. It was closer to a structure. Philip's social life was large, diverse, and largely ungoverned by court convention. He played polo at Smith's Lawn in Windsor Great Park and at Cowdray Park in West Sussex, a world of fast horses, competitive men, and women who were spirited and entirely unawed by his title. He attended country house weekends, shooting parties, and carriage-driving competitions. He was genuinely sociable in ways that formal royal occasions never permitted. The women in that world had their own standing. They were riders and sportswomen and hostesses of genuine capability who could hold their own in any conversation Philip wanted to have. The actress, Patricia Kirkwood, was connected to Philip by a supper at the Milroy Club in London in 1948. Both parties denied any affair, repeatedly and on the record, for decades. A Sunday newspaper published photographs from that evening. The denials continued. Various other names surfaced in journalism across the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Women from the polo set and the country house circuit, none whose connections to Philip were documented as anything beyond the intensive social intimacy of that world. The Queen received these women. She was seen with them at Sandringham and Balmoral. She didn't make scenes. She didn't issue ultimatums. This wasn't naivete. She was the most carefully informed person in Britain, but the product of a deliberate, sustained decision about what the marriage required and what it could sustain. The most useful key to understanding that decision comes from Sasha Hamilton, the Duchess of Abercorn, in her conversation with Giles Brandreth for his 2004 book. Sasha described the Queen as someone who had always given her husband a great deal of leeway, and she passed on the single most illuminating piece of advice that anyone in this story ever recorded. The advice King George VI gave his daughter before she married Philip. "Remember, he's a sailor," the king told Elizabeth. "They come in on the tide." She applied that for 73 years. She waited, and he always came home. The clearest picture of what Philip was actually seeking, as opposed to what the tabloids assumed he was seeking, came from Alexandra Hamilton, the Duchess of Abercorn herself. She was born Alexandra Anastasia Phillips on the 27th of February, 1946, in Tucson, Arizona, where her father, Lieutenant Colonel Harold Bunny Phillips, was stationed. Her mother, Georgina Werner, later known as Lady Kennard, was one of the Queen's close personal circle. Sasha wasn't an outsider to the world she entered. She married James Hamilton, the 5th Duke of Abercorn, in 1966 and settled at Baronscourt, the Hamilton family's 5,500-acre estate in County Tyrone, Northern Ireland. She arrived there at the worst possible moment to be an Anglo-Irish aristocrat, with the troubles about to define the next 3 decades of life in that province. Sasha threw herself into community work, reconciliation initiatives, and educational projects. She was, by the time she came properly into Philip's orbit, a woman with a substantial inner life and her own claims on the world's attention. What held her and Philip together was Carl Jung. Both were serious students of Jung's work. The ideas about the unconscious, about psychological archetypes, about the relationship between the roles people perform publicly and the selves they carry underneath. For a man who had spent his adult life performing a role that never quite fit, That framework had an obvious resonance. Philip visited Baronscourt for carriage driving and for conversations that, by the Irish Times' account of the friendship, ran long on psychology and philosophy. In 2004, Giles Brandreth published Philip and Elizabeth, Portrait of a Marriage, a semi-authorized biography for which he had been given, by his own account, more access to Prince Philip than any journalist had ever been given. Philip sat with him in his Buckingham Palace study, over lunches and dinners, on aircraft and trains. He authorized Brandreth to speak to a specific list of people. Sasha Hamilton, Duchess of Abercorn, was on the list. She spoke to Brandreth for several hours, and what she said was published that September in the Times under the headline, "Duchess Tells of Her Passion for Philip." The heart came into it in a big way, she told him. There is a hugely potent chemical reaction in him. We were close because we understood one another. He felt he could trust me, and I felt I could trust him. Then, with great care, it was a passionate friendship, but the passion was in the ideas. It was certainly not a full relationship. I didn't go to bed with him. It probably looked like that to the world. I can understand why people might have thought it, but it didn't happen. It wasn't like that. He isn't like that. It's complicated, and at the same time, it's quite simple. He needs a playmate and someone to share his intellectual pursuits. Buckingham Palace declined to comment on the book, pointedly, in an attempt, the Times noted, to deny it credibility. There had been a photograph circulating before publication. Philip shirtless, wearing a towel, his arm around Sasha in a swimsuit. Sasha's answer to it was in those paragraphs. Sarah Bradford, also quoted in Brandreth's book, disagreed with Sasha's characterization entirely. Her position was direct. Philip and Sasha Abercorn certainly had an affair, without a doubt. Bradford and Brandreth were working from different sources and different levels of access, and neither can be said to have settled the question. Philip himself, when Brandreth pressed him, offered a line that was either absolute denial or the best deadpan of his long career. "I've had a detective in my company night and day since 1947. Near the end of the conversation, Sasha said something that received less attention than the denials. "I am sorry I don't see him properly anymore. Really sorry. He is a very special man." She was 58 when she said that. They had been close for more than 20 years. She died in December 2018 at the age of 72, after a period of illness. The Baronscourt visits, the Jung conversations, the carriage driving, all of it ended with her. Whatever the full nature of the friendship was, and whatever existed in the correspondence between them, she chose not to adjudicate it publicly, and she didn't. The third relationship, the last and, by every account, the deepest, began with the death of a child. In the summer of 1990, Penny Knatchbull was on holiday in Mallorca with her husband Norton and their 3 children when their youngest, Leonora, was diagnosed with a kidney tumor. She was 5 years old. The family returned to England. The treatment ran for 14 months. On the 22nd of October 1991, Leonora died in a London hospital. She was buried in the grounds of Broadlands, the Knatchbull family home in Hampshire. She was 5 years old. Penny and Norton established the Leonora Children's Cancer Fund in her memory. It eventually merged with the Edwina Mountbatten Trust in 2010 to become the Edwina Mountbatten and Leonora Children's Foundation. Philip wrote to Penny after Leonora's death. The contents of that letter have never been made public, and no one who has referenced it has described what it said. What happened next was that Philip, a few years later, began teaching Penny to drive a carriage. She was 41, he was 73. The carriage driving began around 1994, and from that beginning, the friendship deepened into the closest relationship of his final 3 decades. Penny was, on the face of it, an unlikely candidate for the role she came to occupy. She was the daughter of Reginald Eastwood, a butcher who had founded the Angus Steakhouse chain, and Marion Hood. She had grown up in Switzerland, graduated from the London School of Economics in 1976, and entered the extended royal family through her marriage to Norton. She wasn't aristocracy by birth. She wasn't a Jungian intellectual. She was a woman who had lost a child, who had a quality that Philip apparently found rare. She wasn't afraid of him, and she expected nothing from him except what he chose to give. They competed at carriage driving events together, the Royal Windsor Horse Show, county competitions across the country. They were photographed together so regularly that royal watchers stopped finding it remarkable. Ingrid Seward watched them together at the Royal Yacht Squadron Ball at Cowes Week and wrote in Prince Philip Revealed, "When I saw Philip and Penny gliding around the dance floor, neither of them gave a damn who saw them or what anyone might say." That was Philip's mode when he was comfortable with something. He didn't manage appearances. He simply declined to find appearances interesting. The friendship was what it was, and it was nobody's business but theirs. In 2010, Norton Knatchbull left Penny for another woman. It was, by any measure, a humiliating period for Penny. Philip supported her through it, as he had supported her through Leonora's death. He had supported Norton, his godson, throughout his life. And when Norton behaved badly, Philip's loyalty stayed with Penny. Members of the royal family, the Queen included, were said to admire the way Penny insisted that life at the historic estate must continue as normal. That quality, the ability to hold things together when they were falling apart, was one Philip recognized because he had spent his own adult life exercising it. Philip retired from public duties in August 2017 at the age of 96 and moved to Wood Farm, the 5-bedroom cottage on the edge of the Sandringham estate in Norfolk. The Queen came up from Windsor by train from time to time. Hugo Vickers, in his account of the retirement years, writes that she gave him a loose rein. In a sense, they separated. And Penny Romsey, the new Countess Mountbatten, often stayed with him there. Stayed with him. As a houseguest. As a companion. As the person Philip was, by Vickers's account, at his happiest to see. The car accident in January 2019 clarified the dynamic in another way. Philip, 97 years old, was driving his Land Rover Freelander near the Sandringham estate when it was struck by another vehicle. Philip was unhurt, but the other car's occupants suffered minor injuries, and the footage of the 97-year-old Duke emerging from an overturned vehicle wasn't something the palace could manage away. The Queen wanted him to stop driving. Philip didn't want to stop driving. Ingrid Seward writes that the Queen enlisted Penny's help. She asked Penny to visit Philip and make the case. 3 weeks after the accident, Philip voluntarily surrendered his driving license. Whatever Penny said to him in that conversation hasn't been recorded. The episode itself shows how far the relationship had traveled by 2019. The woman the Queen had once been reluctant to welcome into the inner circle had become the person the Queen trusted to manage her husband in the matters that actually mattered. What did the Queen know, and what did she choose? The question sounds prosecutorial. It shouldn't. The better version of it simply, what was the actual architecture of this marriage? Sarah Bradford, in Elizabeth, a biography of Britain's Queen, makes the argument most directly. The Queen made an active decision early in the marriage to allow Philip a significant degree of personal latitude. Not passive tolerance, not looking away. A deliberate choice made from a clear-eyed understanding of who Philip was and what he needed the marriage to contain. He was too large a personality, too restless, too in need of intellectual engagement and emotional freedom to be satisfied by the formal structure of royal life alone. He had given up his career. He had given up his name. He walked behind her in public for 69 years. In private, Prince Edward told the cameras after his father's death, Philip and the Queen were, for each other, the one person they could talk to without restraint, the one person with whom they could smile about things that you perhaps couldn't in public. The marriage was real. The emotional core of it was real. The accommodation was also real, and the two things weren't in contradiction. They were the reason the marriage held together for as long as it did. Sasha's account of the Queen's approach is the most direct-sourced statement on this that exists. The Queen had always given her husband a lot of leeway. Her father had told her before she married him, "Remember, he's a sailor. They come in on the tide." This wasn't, in the world of European royal marriages, an unusual framework. It was the framework that had governed aristocratic partnerships for centuries, in which the public performance of the marriage was one thing, and its private terms were another. And neither party had any interest in confusing the two. Philip understood the terms and honored them completely. In 73 years, he never once publicly embarrassed the Queen. He never gave the press a scene. He never made a statement about any of the women in his orbit in any direction. He kept his own counsel so effectively that Giles Brandreth, who had more access to him than any journalist in history, could only quote him on the subject as saying, "I've had a detective in my company night and day since 1947. He came in on the tide, every time." For 73 years, Brandreth, who knew them both, describes the marriage in his books as the central fact of Philip's existence, not despite its complexity, but because of it. Two people who understood each other completely, who had made accommodations that were never spoken aloud and therefore never needed to be renegotiated, who had built something together that was stronger for being honest about what it required. It wasn't the romance Britain was sold. It was something more durable. On the 17th of April, 2021, 8 days after Philip's death, his funeral was held at St. George's Chapel in Windsor Castle. COVID-19 regulations limited attendance to 30 mourners. In ordinary times, 800 people would have been there. Buckingham Palace said the Queen faced some very difficult decisions about who the 30 would be. Philip's 4 children were there. 8 grandchildren attended with their spouses. 3 German relatives, whose ancestors had been kept from the 1947 wedding because of wartime feeling, were among the 30, because Philip had specifically requested it. The coffin was draped with his personal standard, Denmark, Greece, Mountbatten, Edinburgh in its 4 quarters, and carried his naval cap, his sword, and a wreath of white roses and lilies with a note written by the Queen. Before the procession began, Philip's favorite driving carriage stood in the quadrangle of Windsor Castle, pulled by his 2 black fell ponies, Balmoral Nevis and Knotlaw Storm. On the driver's seat were laid his driving cap, his whip, and his driving gloves. Everything that was Philip in his private life. The ponies, the carriage, the equipment of the sport he had shared for nearly 30 years with the person he most wanted beside him. Placed in the background while the official ceremony unfolded, no eulogies were delivered at Philip's own wish. 4 singers performed music he had handpicked himself, including Benjamin Britten's Jubilate in C, which Philip had commissioned. The Queen sat alone in the chapel, 2 meters from the nearest mourner, a small figure in black with a white handkerchief. Her children, her grandchildren, Philip's German relatives all sat appropriately distanced, in the strict configuration the pandemic required. Penelope Knatchbull, Countess Mountbatten of Burma, was among the 30. She was the only non-family member. In the official order of service she was listed, in the formal language available to describe her, as the Countess Mountbatten of Burma, first cousin once removed in law. The closest technical designation for what she was, which wasn't quite family and not quite not, and which fit none of the standard categories. She sat in the second pew, slightly behind the immediate family. A brief shot appeared in the live broadcast. The British press noted her attendance without particular remark. After the service, both women returned separately to their accommodations on the Windsor estate. Each had known Philip for a different lifetime. Each had been, in her own way, part of the 73 years. 17 months later, Queen Elizabeth II died at Balmoral on the 8th of September, 2022. Her state funeral was held at Westminster Abbey on the 19th. Penny Knatchbull attended that too. She walked in with her daughter, Lady Alexandra, present at the end as she had been through so much of what came before it. 3 women: Helen Cordet, Sasha Hamilton, Penelope Knatchbull. Helen died in Switzerland in April 1996. She had said, more than once in the years before her death, that she would take her secrets with her. She did. The question of whether Philip fathered her children remains permanently open. Max Blazeau denied it his entire adult life and spent much of that life in China, at sufficient distance from the British press to make the question harder to ask. Louise built her own career and her own life. Philip said nothing. Hélène kept her word. Sasha Hamilton died in December 2018 at 72. She had, in her own words to Giles Brandreth, been sorry for years that she and Philip no longer saw each other properly. She had spoken about the friendship more honestly than anyone else connected to Philip or the palace had ever spoken about anything. Had named what it was, had named what it wasn't, had used the precision of someone who had thought carefully about the difference. Whatever correspondence existed between them, she chose not to place it in the public record. She died knowing what she knew. Penny Knatchbull is in her early 70s now. She lives at Broadlands, managing the estate as her husband Norton deals with the progression of Alzheimer's disease. She does not give interviews. She was at Philip's funeral. She was at the Queen's funeral. She has been a presence at the edge of the official picture for 50 years, beginning when she was 20 years old and dated the man she would marry, and continuing through the letter after Leonora's death, the carriage driving lessons, the years at Wood Farm, the driving license conversation, and the second pew in the chapel on the 17th of April, 2021. None of these 3 women ever said what they knew. None of them ever said precisely what they had been. They had each known a man who kept his own counsel throughout a life conducted almost entirely in public, and who kept it to the end. The marriage that enclosed all of this lasted 73 years. It produced 4 children, 8 grandchildren, a record-long reign, and a 73-year record of public dignity that no one who lived inside it has ever contradicted. Britain was shown a romance. The romance was accurate. It was just not the whole story. Anyone who looked carefully enough, at the Godfather paying school fees in 1950, at the Duchess gliding around the dance floor at Cowes, and also on every guest list at Wood Farm, could see the rest of it, waiting, just behind the frame. The woman he was married to had known, the whole time, exactly who they were. She made her choice about that early, and she never reversed it. He came in on the tide. It was, on its own terms, a success. If you want more stories like this, subscribe.